Everybody, Happy New Year. This is now January 2015, and I'm doing a new screencast on Django-cms. This particular topic is about sitemaps, which is actually just a Django contrib module, and it's not really specific to the CMS. However, most of our users who use the CMS are very interested in SEO, search engine optimization, and therefore sitemaps is pretty relevant in their in their job. And there are also some specifics related to the CMS that you should be aware of when you're using sitemaps. So I thought I would have this screencast. Also, it was recommended or suggested in the Google Plus community as a topic to cover for the screencast. So I know there's a couple of people out there who are eager to see this. Anyway, so what is a sitemap? So a sitemap is basically an XML document which has a specific form. That form is determined by a consortium of companies working together. In particular, it's the major search engines, and I'm sure by now probably all the search engines use sitemaps. This standard has been in place for a long time. I mean, this particular page I'm looking at was last updated, looks like 7 years ago. So this is a protocol that's been in place for some time now, and if you're not aware of sitemaps, you really should be. So also a little bit of history. In the past, when I was using sitemaps, using different languages other than Python and different frameworks other than Django, there weren't, in my experience, there weren't any built-in ways of dealing with sitemaps, and they were considered to be, an extra thing that you did for yourself. And I found myself using third-party tools which would actually, scan or crawl through my site and find all the unique URLs, and then create the sitemap for me, which sounds great, but the problem is that it's horribly inefficient to crawl through your site to find out where all the URLs are. That just doesn't make a lot of sense. The beautiful thing about Django is that we have this great URL resolver system, which helps us keep our URLs dry and well formed, and provides a nice way to map URLs onto basically code. So it wouldn't. I don't think it would make a great deal of sense to continue using third-party tools to scrape your website and crawl through it and find all the unique URLs. So some smart people came up with at the Django project. They came up with contrib'ed sitemaps, which I think is a nice complement to the existing URL resolving system. So just to put it in perspective a little bit, the URL resolving system built into Django is really great at providing a mapping of URLs into code, and it kind of provides, through patterns. It says basically if somebody provides this URL, map that to this particular bit of functionality, and it does a really good job of that. Now, where it kind of falls short is doing the opposite, saying, I have all this code, show me all the URLs that will access this code. It doesn't do that, right? This is where the Django's contrib sitemap framework helps us out. It's not automatic. You have to tell it how to do things. Computers only do what you tell them to do. The framework, the sitemap framework, is indeed a framework, and so you have to provide the detail about your specific implementation, and then it will take it from there and do the right thing. So first of all, let's look and see what a sitemap looks like. So I'm going to go back to the sitemaps.org and go to the protocol, and there's an example. So here's a very simple but complete XML document which describes a sitemap. And you can see it's pretty well formed. It's pretty makes a lot of sense. You have the location of your particular URL or web resource, when it was last modified. That's of course important to search engines because they don't want to be re-scanning things they've already scanned on your site. Change frequency. So this basically tells them, when should we expect to come back and rescan this roughly. Now this is not a number, this is just a keyword, and there's a few of them that are defined: monthly, weekly, yearly, never, etc. And you can look through this website to see all the values if you want. And then priority, I guess this is just for them to figure out, if I only have time to do one page at your site when I'm scanning your site, says the search engine, then which one should I use? And so the priority gives them an idea of how to weight their resources. So anyway, so it's a pretty straightforward XML document, very readable. Real pain in the butt if you're going to try and create these by hand, or so you just don't want to do that. Anyway, so for the rest of this talk, what we're going to be talking about is how to implement sitemaps into the sample project that we've been working on throughout this entire screencast series. And to refresh your memory, this is what it looks like. This is the site, and it has a few. This is the menu. It has a few sections. If you're unfamiliar with what some of these things are and why they're implemented the way they are, please do look at some of the other screencasts, and you'll see what we've done here. Probably the most significant thing that we've done with respect to sitemaps is we have it's internationalized, so we have 2 languages that we're supporting on the site. That's going to be important. And the other thing is that we have some app hooks. So the product gallery is actually an app hook. So we have an app called, well, here's the apps. We have an app called Products, and that is hooked to the product gallery page. We have another app called Staff, and that's hooked to the leadership page. And we have a third app hook, which is News, and that is connected to a news page. So these 3 pages in the menu are app hooks, and the rest of them are not. So Home, About, and Contact Us are regular pages in the CMS, and these 3 here are app hooks. That's going to be important. The reason it's important is because the team at the Django-cms have already created basically the sitemap capability that you need if you're going to use sitemaps. And so that's great and all, but it doesn't cover your app hooks, right? Because at the end of the day, we don't know what you've built on your app hook. We don't know the details, and so you have to provide your own sitemaps for those apps. Okay. Now, just one more word on apps. So you can see in my project I have other apps here. I have Gist, I have clippings, contacts, and just to refresh your memory, clippings are things that we attach to the staff page. So I think if we go to Adam Anderson's page, yeah, we can see these clippings here, which are basically just, most of them are links, or some of them are references to news posts. And these are attached to the staff member in question. So these are not really eligible for usage with sitemaps because they are things that augment an existing URL. They're not on a dedicated URL of their own. Now, Adam Anderson's page, he's a staff member. This does make sense to put in sitemap because it has its own URL, right? So clippings is not really eligible for sitemap usage. CMS extensions contains things like it contains our page extension that we did and things like that. So not really relevant. Contacts. This provides for us the let's see. I think we have a dedicated contact us page. Now this is actually this is an app hook. I think, and it could be eligible for sitemap. The thing is that there's no sub content, right? There's no detail view for contact us. It's just a single thing that's placed here on this page. And to be honest, at this moment in time, I don't recall if we did this as an app hook or if we did this as a plugin. But it doesn't matter because there's no subtree of content here. It's just a single thing on the URL that we've attached it to, if it's even an app hook. So that again means it's not really eligible because even if you have an app hook on a specific URL, the CMS implementation of sitemaps will handle that. It's really when you want to deal with things below that entry point where you need to be concerned with sitemaps. So also the contact app is also used on, let's see, where do we have it on the leadership page? Yeah, so we have this plugin here. This is definitely a plugin that comes from the contacts app. But it's again not a dedicated URL. This plugin could appear in multiple places, and in fact, I believe it does appear in multiple places. Yeah, here it is here as well. Okay, so contacts is kind of out now. Gist, you may recall from one of the screencasts, is a plugin to allow us to just connect GitHub gists to our page. So these are actually put into the placeholders of text placeholders, actually text plugins. So again, these are not going to be on their own URL, so there's no need to create a sitemap for gist. So that leaves us with news, products, and staff that we're going to be concerned with. But before we get into the implementation details for the apps, let's have a look and see what what do you have to do to set up sitemaps just for the CMS, right? So I'm going to go ahead and close this. Well, actually, I'm going to open this, but I'm going to close all the apps for now. We're going to go to our settings. So the first thing you're going to do when you're connecting up sitemaps into your project is you have to make sure that you put Django.contrib.sitemaps in your installed apps. Now this is, like all the contrib modules, this is already part of your Django installation. You don't have to download or pip install anything. Once you've installed Django, then you already have this. You just have to make sure that you reference it in your installed apps. And then the other thing you have to do is you have to update your URLs. So like anything else, sitemaps, in this case sitemap.xml is the standard place to put your sitemap, and you have to attach that to your URLs. So just a word on that. You can't really put sitemap.xml anywhere you want. There are specific rules which you can learn about once you go to sitemaps.org, and there's actually a whole section on it. Basically, if you attach a sitemap to a subtree of your website, then it can only contain URLs that are also in the same subtree. This is a security detail, and if you try to include URLs in your sitemap that are not in the same subtree as where the sitemap is defined, then the search engines will actually reject your sitemap altogether. So you definitely want to follow the rules on that. So the safest thing to do is to define it at the root of your website's tree, URL tree. So that's what I'm doing here, is defined at the root. And sitemap.xml is the you pretty much want to use that file name, resource name. You can probably get away with calling it something else. I don't know why you'd want to, but you probably could if you provided the right meta tags in your content. But I don't recommend it. And I think that the sitemap people also say they're going to look here for the sitemap. So you want to stick with that. Now there's at least two ways to provide sitemaps. I'm using the index method here. So what this basically says is that the sitemap that's located here is going to be a special XML document which really just provides an index of other sitemaps. And we're going to take a look at that real quick. So this is what it looks like. You can see we don't have all the detail in here about priority or change frequency, or the last modification date. We just have the location of more sitemaps. So we do this because the different apps and app hooks that we have need to be treated as separate sitemaps, the way we're implementing it. So this provides us a way, an extensible manner of providing a number of different sitemaps that all act together as one big sitemap. So, so this is how we set that up. Now, basically what happens is we have to pass to it a sitemap. Well, we're going to pass to it a dictionary of parameters, and in that dictionary of parameters we're going to provide a sitemaps object, which is itself a dictionary. And we do that both here and here. And the reason is because this is going to use the sitemap dictionary to figure out how to build its index, and it'll have basically one sitemap block per sitemap. And then down here, this block here is going to create a whole, a whole resource, one for each sitemap, right? So pretty straightforward so far. Now, if you're only going to be doing a CMS site with no app hooks, then basically you just do this, right? You don't even have to worry about this part here. You just have this. You define a sitemaps dictionary, says CMS pages, and you import cms.sitemaps .cms sitemap, and you include that there, and then you're done, right? So this handles all of the CMS pages automatically. This literally, you'd be done. We would be, in fact, if I save this and I run it, we'll get a very simple index which has only the one reference, and we can go look at that, and we'll see all the pages that are in the CMS. And you'll notice that we have both the English and the French where they are translated. In some cases, like the About page, we haven't actually created or published a French version, so that doesn't show up. We don't see a French version of the About, so there's no point in putting it into the sitemap if it doesn't exist, and it doesn't. So I think it does the right thing. Pretty straightforward and super easy to do, and the CMS does the right thing for you. However, we do have the app hooks, and we do need to address those. So the way I've set it up, and this is by no means there's not just one way to do this, but the way I've done it is I have in the sitemaps dictionary I include the CMS, and I include non-translated apps. So in our implementation for this project, we have news and staff, which are not translated apps. They do not use Parlay to translate anything. The reason is because the news site basically, the idea was that you would provide articles. I don't know if it's actually implemented in this sample app, but the idea would be that you would provide news in English or in French. You don't try to translate the French news story into English. You just create a new news story and you put it in the other language, right? So, and then the idea would be that when you're viewing it in English or French, then it would show only the relevant language stories. So there wasn't a whole lot of need to do a lot of translation there. Now staff, arguably this should be translated, but it's not. We just haven't done it. The biography of well, I mean, to be honest, I don't know if we actually have to. So let's look at that real quick. So under leadership, I mean, we have names shown here, and we have these titles. These arguably could be translated, and perhaps we should have. But the names don't really translate. And if we click on the person's page, again, we have a name. This probably could be translated, but we didn't. And then this is all inside of a placeholder, and the CMS would allow us to translate that. So, maybe we could do the translation. I don't know, but we didn't. So that's an untranslated app. Now we do have a translated app, and that is products. And let me just show you that real quick. So we have an English version of the product list page or list view, and then we can also go to the French version, and we can see it theoretically in French. And if we go to the detail page, we see, imagine this is a description in French, and we can go back and forth between English and French. This is very, properly translated, and you can see that not only does the content change, but also the slug of the page changes, and that's going to be a detail that you want to pay attention to right now when we do the sitemaps. So here we have basic widget slug, and then here we have the basic widget slug in French. So so that's properly translated. So you know, ideally our site would be fully translated, but I like the fact in this case that we have some that are and some that are not, because it kind of shows all the different cases here, well, at least a number of different cases that we can highlight in this screencast. So let's first look at a plain app. So pretend I didn't have any translation, and I think for many people a non-translated sitemap is going to be all they need. So let's look at the news sitemap. So you can see here that in my sitemaps dictionary that's going to be included down here, we have CMS pages, and we also have news, and we're including this class here, which I've imported here from apps.news.sitemaps. So that's something that I've created. Let's have a look at it. apps.news.sitemaps. Okay, here we go. So this is how you implement a sitemap for a normal app, right? Basically, you just import from django.contrib'ed.sitemaps.sitemap, and that's really all you need. I think I have time zone here just to check and see if, okay, so let's just walk through it. So what you have to have for sure is you have to have this block here. This is, you define a method. First of all, you inherit from sitemap, right? You create your own class inheriting from sitemap, and you have to create this method items. Now what the purpose of items is that you have to tell the sitemap framework how to enumerate these objects, the news objects in this case. So it's pretty simple. I mean, we can lean heavily on the ORM and just basically return a query set, but we have to tell it, you know, what the right query set is. In this case, we're saying we only want to put in the sitemap published news objects. So if somebody writes a news object in and it's not published yet, we certainly don't want to expose its URL in the sitemaps. You know, I mean, what if the headline was something like, you know, Acme Co. Declares bankruptcy? You certainly don't want that to show up in your sitemap index before it's published. And then similarly, we have a capability in our news, the way we defined our model, that you can actually publish something for the future. So the state is published, but you don't want it to show up until a certain time. So the news date, if it's in the future, basically we don't want it to appear in the list. So we're basically saying if it's published and the published date is less than or equal to now, then it's okay to put it in the sitemap, right? So this is basic standard query set. Pretty simple. And in fact, this is one of the more complicated ones for this particular project because it has these details about publishing in the future and stuff. The rest of them are pretty straightforward. So this is, at a minimum, you have to define this in your sitemap, but it's not a lot of work. It's actually quite straightforward. This one right here is locations. Well, let me back up. Let me tell you how the sitemaps work. So basically, the way this works is the framework sets up a class kind of structure which allows it to go through all your sitemaps, and it uses the items to figure out what objects you have that need to be considered for the sitemap. Once you have a list of items, then it goes through and executes the location or the last mod or the change frequency or the priority methods on your class to determine the attributes for that particular item. So in this case, it gets a list of items, in this case news articles, and then it goes through that list and executes these methods in order to get the location and the last modification date. Now you could also declare methods for change frequency and priority, and you would be able to provide a priority and a change frequency specific to that particular news article in the same fashion that we do location and last mod. Excuse me. But the sitemaps framework also allows you to create these as class attributes in cases where they don't change. So this is very handy in that if I want to treat all of my news items or objects of this class to have the same change frequency and the same priority, then I can just do it as class attributes instead of defining a method to do so. So that's pretty nice and convenient. But for things like location and last modification date, those are going to be pretty specific to the item, and you're probably going to want to do it as a method. And again, it's pretty simple. You just basically, you pass in the item and then you return out, in this case, the location of that object, in this case, the get absolute URL, or the modification date, in this case, a property on the news object, which is the modification date. So the important thing to know here is that I've included this explicitly, this one, but this is the default behavior. If you don't declare a location, then by default the sitemap framework will will call the get absolute URL method for your item. So I could actually comment this out or delete it, and it would still work exactly as it should. So I'm going to leave it in just to be explicit here, but just bear in mind you can remove this if you want to. And let's have a look and see what this produces. So we're going to look at just the news items. I'm going to go back to my index, sitemap index, and I'm going to look for the one for news. Here it is right here, and then we're going to look at that and see what it produces. Okay, so it looks like we have 4 articles, and it shows the last modification date, and it shows the change frequency, and it shows a priority, just as we had planned. And again, remember that the location comes from the method which we declared on our news model. Let's see if I can find that real quick. Here we go, news item. Where we had declared a method, where is it? Get absolute URL, which simply uses the URL subsystem of the resolver to basically pull up the location of this news object. So it's all interconnected, but it works very nicely. So that's a normal app, and just for completeness, I'll show you what I have for the staff one. It's actually even more simple, and the reason is because I didn't explicitly define the location. I'm going to let it implicitly use the get absolute URL method on the staff object, and I don't have a last modification date, so I didn't declare that, and what that means is it just won't appear. And you can see that if I were to go to sitemap staff, that we get a sitemap that includes, it doesn't include the last modification date, but otherwise it looks like it should. We have all of the staff members that we have defined in the sitemap. So far so good. Now that brings us to our remaining app, which is products, and this is actually a little bit more complicated, but not a lot. And hopefully you'll see that I'm going to help you make it look really, be really simple. So again, this block here is where I define my sitemaps for my translated apps. And basically what we're doing is we're just looping through our languages that we defined in settings. So just to be clear, we have in our settings, we have a languages property, which is a tuple of tuples. And we basically, in the tuple, we have the language code, and then we have the language name in text. In this case, it's a faux translated text. But anyway, so we have English and French. These are the 2 things that we're interested in here, right? These 2 language codes. And if you wanted to be, if you could make this the 5-character definition, it could be EN-US. Or whatever, however you set it up, doesn't matter. This is what we're interested in. So what we're doing is we're looping through the languages. We're extracting out of the list of it's a tuple of tuples. So we're going to basically enumerate them, and then we're going to extract the values of the tuples. So in this case, we're extracting the language code, and then we're ignoring the name. We don't need it. So we're using the convention of the single underscore to ignore that part of the tuple. And then I use the translation override context manager, and basically I'm overriding the current language to be the language defined here. So basically it's you know, we're now going to be in English or French depending on where we are in the for loop. And then what I do is I go off and I instantiate my sitemap, and I'm going to pass in this parameter which I've defined here. This is not standard in any stretch of the word. This is just something that I do. So basically when I instantiate my class map for products, I'm going to pass in the language that I want it to be relevant for. And then I also update the key of my dict for the sitemaps. I append the language code to the app name, in this case products. So basically I'm just saying, create, in summary, I'm creating a new sitemap entry for each language for each of the translated apps. And then I'm basically just going to put this into the sitemap. So we've defined sitemaps up here, but I'm going to start adding some new things, one per translated app per language. And then I'm done, right? So all the magic is going to be in here. So let's have a look at that. Go to products and go to sitemaps. So it's a little bit more complicated than some of the others, but I try to make it as simple as possible. I have it broken into two classes. This is a kind of a super class, or really an intermediate class between sitemap and product sitemap. But I've done this to show that you can take out a lot of the boilerplate. If you're going to be doing this for a number of different apps that are all translated, you can use the same. You could maybe move this into a base class somewhere, a base module, and then you could use it throughout your whole system. So the idea is that we are using a regular sitemap, but then we add a constructor, and in the constructor we're declaring that we might have this optional keyword argument, and if it is set, then we're going to set a class property or class attribute to whatever we passed in, right? So you can imagine that if I was going through the loop defined over here, and we were in French, then this would instantiate a version of whatever sitemap, and it would include the language French as a property on a class. And then the only other thing that's really important here is that when we are looping through and creating the location, we must do that in the context of a French language, and that's how Django works, right? Is it will automatically provide for you the URL for a translated app when you're in the context of French, right, or whatever language it is. So what we do is we again use a translation override context manager. We pass in the language that we've stored as a class attribute, and then we try to get the URL. And this works nicely. So again, this is generic, and that's why it's been pulled into a superclass. But then once we've done that, then we're pretty much back to where we were before with the simplicity of sitemaps that we have for the non-translated apps. Notice I'm not redefining the location because I do want to use this implementation. I just simply got to define my items. Now this does take some care. When in my translated apps, I don't want to pass it all the URLs. I want to pass it only the ones where there is a translated version for the current language. Otherwise, we'll be passing in things that don't have a URL defined because they don't exist. And that's why I have this comment here that note if we did our job right in items, this shouldn't happen. So we shouldn't get a no reverse match exception in the case where the object doesn't exist because we've filtered those out, right? So this is it. So again, you could pull this into its own module somewhere, and then you could use this throughout, and then you could just say if it's a translated app, I'm gonna create my sitemap as a subclass of I18N sitemap instead of regular sitemap, and that would make things pretty simple. So once you have all this together, you go back to your URLs, and we've now appended this to our sitemaps object, and business as usual, we just continue on and show our create our sitemaps as usual. Let's have a look and see what that looks like. We can go back to the index, and then we can see now we have two entries. We have sitemap products French, and we have sitemap products English. Let's have a look at that. So the English one looks like this, and you can see we have the basic widget, the deluxe widget, and the platinum widget. These are the English URLs for each of those, and then we also have the French version. I'm just going to fiddle with the URL, and we can see we have a sitemap defined for each of the same objects, but now in different languages here. So you put it all together, and you have all these different sitemaps covering our CMS pages, our non-translated apps, of which we have 2 of, and our translated apps, of which we have 1 of, and it all just works. So when Google or Bing or whatever comes to your site and pulls up your sitemaps, they will have all of your URLs at hand, and they'll have your idea of what the priority and the change frequency are, and they can make the best decisions about how to crawl your site and give you the best SEO possible. So that's great. So that's how you use sitemaps in your project. And we could just stop there and be done with it. However, I want to say that I don't think it ends there, and that you have now this new capability of being able to express what all of your URLs in your project are. And the way this might be important to you, and the way I use it, is, well, I use it in a number of ways, but one of them is, let's say I have a complicated site, and let's say I have 1,000 different, let's say I have 2-3 dozen different URL patterns defined, and in my urls.py, and all the sub patterns I've defined in different files, and then let's say I have several thousand different resources on all of those different URL patterns, right? So it's a pretty large site, and then I make a change to one of the modules somewhere, and I'm not really sure if it broke something somewhere. Wouldn't it be nice to be able to execute basically all of your views, all of your resources, to see if everything doesn't return a 500 error? That would be nice. So you can do that, right? So now that you have the sitemaps in place, and provided that you've kept it up for all of your apps, which you're going to want to do for SEO purposes anyway, we can use that. So the way I use it, and this is just me personally, this is not an official anything, I've created something called CSU Cache Tools, which I use in all my projects basically, and it provides a number of different things which all leverage the sitemaps capability. Now it includes some things that may not be important to you, like I use a front-end cache called Varnish, and this allows me to distribute those caches around the world for a makeshift CDN, content delivery network. And I've integrated that into this so that every time I clear my cache, then I'm also clearing my remote Varnish caches. And I almost always use memcached. So wouldn't it be nice if we had automatic cache invalidation, so that when I make a change to an object which affects certain pages or whatever, it will clear the memcache, right? So that we don't have stale objects floating around. And that's really what this does. Is in my CSU Cache Tools project, I have where if I add a class property to any class that I've defined that I think can affect the output of the pages, then anytime one of these objects gets saved, it detects that using signals, and then it clears the cache, clears the memcache, right, automatically. And I can also clear that memcache with a management command. So let's just look real quick at what this does. I'm not sure why I have this error here. It looks like I canceled something. Anyway, let me just go ahead and restart, make sure that's all clean, yeah. And then I'm going to open a new window. I need the server to be running to run these management commands. So the server is running on the other terminal window, and in this terminal window I'm going to work on the same project, which is creatively named project. And first thing I'm going to do, I'm just going to list my management commands. So we have all these different modules providing some functionality, but here's cache tools, and we have clear cache, list URLs, and pre-cache. Those are the three things that it can do. So clear cache, as I mentioned, will allow me to clear the cache. This is referring to the mem cache, or whatever you've configured your cache to be for your Django CMS implementation. I do recommend memcache if you can. It's the most performant. So so that's really convenient already. So if I've made some changes and I redeployed on a running server, and I want to clear the memcache, one way to do it is restart the whole memcache, but that's a little bit like using a sledgehammer to kill a fly. Or I can just execute now this management command, and it will clear the cache for me. So that's good because it gets rid of all the stale objects. Now, as I mentioned, Sisu cache tools will automatically detect changes and automatically will clear the cache where it's relevant, and then so I really don't have to do this a whole lot. But if I do make some changes to the site and redeploy, it's a nice peace of mind to be able to clear the cache. But the next thing I can do is I can list URLs, and this will show me all of the URLs in my project. Now, the way this works is it basically scans my sitemap dictionary from my URLs, and then it for each of the sitemaps it finds, it then goes through and executes the items method on that sitemap and pulls out the URL that it returns and then assembles it to create a truly absolute URL, because normally it just returns this. So there's a little bit of logic in there that says if we're in debug mode, aka we're running run server, then it will use this host name and this port here. But if we were not in debug mode, we were in production mode, then it would use whatever domain we have defined in our site contrib'ed.sites implementation. And you can see that when we were looking at the sitemaps that we were creating, it was using this as the host name because that's what I had set here. Let's see, I'm going to go to administration, and then we have, here's our contrib.sites, and this is where you define the domain name of your project, and this is where it gets that value. So if I were to change this to example.com, which is actually the default, then we'll see that our sitemaps, when we regenerate them, now contain that domain name. So that's where that comes from. So if you find yourself scratching your head saying, where does this example.com come from, or whatever's here, and it's not the correct thing, you'll know you need to go and you need to change your sites setting for contrib.sites in the admin. Anyway, so that's what list URLs does. It basically just gives me all the URLs available based on my sitemap. So this is a nice way to leverage all the work that you've done on the sitemaps to begin with. I mean, you already have great functionality with respect to SEO there, but you've already done the work. Why not go ahead and use it somewhere else? And in this case, it provides all the URLs of my project. So I'm going to take it one step further, and if I do, I'm going to go ahead and clear the cache, and now what I'm going to do is I'm going to do pre-cache, right? That's the other command that I've defined here in Sisu Cache Tools. What it will do is actually it will construct a GET request and execute it for every one of the pages that it finds in my sitemaps. So effectively what's happened is it's just loaded all of the stuff that it can into the memcache, right? And we can see that if we execute this a second time, we should see a reduced execution time because the memcache is helping us out here. And we do. We see we've saved a third of a second exactly. Well, not exactly a third, but exactly 3/10 of a second. Just to show this again, I'm going to clear the cache. I'm going to execute pre-cache, so it's going to load 25 pages, and it does so in 1.039 seconds. And then if I do it again, well, that was interesting. I mean, it seems like it was pretty quick that time. Let's try it again. See if we get. It's actually slightly longer. I'm not sure what's going on here, but this is all local and in development mode. It's not that really, not really important. Oh, you know what the problem is here is that in development I'm actually bypassing the cache in my settings. So I have a dummy cache set up. We're not actually caching anything, we're just pretending to. And that's recommended if you're doing development, because you could be looking at stale output and not realizing that you have something wrong. But when you're in production, you are actually going to be using, a proper cache manager, and usually it's memcache, and this makes a huge difference. So what it means is when I'm let's go again back to this example of having a site with thousands of pages, and I have a memcache set up, so it still performs pretty nicely. But the problem is that when I go in and deploy a change that is going to require me to invalidate my cache, I don't want to leave my users to have to pre-populate or populate the cache for me, because they'll get subpar performance, right? I'd rather that I force the cache to be loaded up, and the way I can do that is by executing this pre-cache command, which basically loads all my thousands of pages now, one after the other, and it does so locally, so it doesn't have to go across the network. But effectively it loads up the cache with all of my objects, and then when my customers come to the website, then they're getting the best foot forward on performance. So that's how I use sitemaps. One other thing I'd like to talk about, and this is has nothing to do with Sisu cache tools, but everything to do with the sitemap framework, is there's a capability in here called ping Google. I'm going to go down to it here in the docs. Yeah, so here it is here, and basically what it does is there's a management command that it offers, and I'm going to show you that now. So if I do manage.py again, and I go through here, we should find under sitemaps, yeah, ping Google. So when you execute that management command, basically what it will do is it will send a message to Google that says, hello there, my site has a new updated sitemap, and here's the URL for it. Please scan at your leisure, right? So basically it's a way of proactively telling Google, or well, it only works for Google, that your site has updated content, and please to come as soon as you can and crawl my site. And in fact, not recrawl it, but here's the specific resources that you should focus on. That's what the sitemap does. Now, just note that this will not work unless you've already registered your project with Google Webmaster Tools. And I'm sure that if you are using SEO on your project, then you already have done that. But if you haven't, then you need to register your site with Google Webmaster Tools, and then ping Google will do what it's supposed to do. Now, they do provide, I think this is a little bit irresponsible, they show an example bit of code here which shows you how you can ping Google every single time an object of a class is saved. I think this is irresponsible, because if you have an object which is, maybe you have an object which your users change, and in aggregate everybody's saving thousands of times per second because you have a large site, then basically you're going to be sending these pings to Google thousands of times per second. I think they're going to get annoyed with you. So like I said, I think this is a little bit irresponsible. I think it makes more sense to call this as a management command when you've made changes, or you could even do it on a scheduled basis. But suddenly that doesn't make sense, because what you could just simply do is change your change frequency of your objects in your sitemap, and Google will automatically know to come and re-index your site. So anyway, pinging Google is great if you use it responsibly, but it's a pretty cool feature of the sitemaps framework. So that's all I have to talk about. So we've covered off sitemaps, what they are, how to create them. I've demonstrated that the CMS provides a pre-built sitemap class for you. You could probably build your own, but there's not really much point in it. We do provide the right tool for you there. And then also I've showed you how to create your own sitemaps for your app hooks. both translated and non-translated. As usual, I will post this code up to the repo, which I keep, let's see, I keep it here, somewhere in here, on my, where is it? Okay, staff app demo. So here's where I keep the code for all of these screencasts, and I will post this up there shortly. Looks like I'm behind a couple, but anyway, happy coding with Django CMS, and we'll see you next time.